The dust cloud from the departing wagon had barely settled when Eleanor Mitchell stood alone on the auction block, her calloused hands folded in front of her worn dress, watching the man who'd just purchased her life walk away without so much as a backward glance. The auctioneer's hammer had fallen with the finality of a coffin nail, sealing her fate for the sum of $47, less than the price of a decent horse, but enough to settle her late husband's gambling debts. What none of the jeering crowd knew, what even Eleanor herself had forgotten in the depths of her despair, was that beneath the surface of this supposedly barren woman lay a strength that would soon reshape the very foundations of Clearwater County. The man who'd bought her contract thought he was acquiring a household servant. He had no idea he'd just purchased the key to his family's salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Millfield's town square when Eleanor Mitchell first realized her world was about to collapse entirely. She stood in the doorway of what had been her home for 3 years, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that might as well have been her death warrant. The foreclosure notice bore the official seal of the county courthouse, but the real power behind it belonged to Marcus Dalton, the banker who'd been circling her property like a vulture ever since her husband Thomas had died 6 months earlier. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she read the terms once more, though she'd memorized every cruel word. Due to outstanding debts totaling $127 to $50, the property known as the Mitchell homestead would be seized and sold at public auction. All personal effects and livestock would be liquidated to satisfy creditors. And in a provision that made her stomach turn, the notice included a clause that had become increasingly common in these desperate times. Should liquid assets prove insufficient to satisfy all debts, the surviving spouse may be bound to labor contract to complete payment. She'd heard whispers of such arrangements in the general store, hushed conversations between women who spoke in euphemisms about neighbors who'd gone to work for their creditors. But Eleanor had never imagined she'd find herself in such circumstances. Thomas had been a dreamer, always chasing the next big opportunity, but she'd believed his assurances that their debts were manageable. Now she understood that his gambling had been far worse than she'd known, and his sudden death from a heart attack had left her to face the consequences alone. The irony wasn't lost on her that much of the community's judgment stemmed from her failure to bear children. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by her fertility, Eleanor had endured 7 years of pitying looks and whispered conversations that always seemed to stop when she entered a room. The town's women treated her with the careful courtesy reserved for those touched by some mysterious curse, while their husbands speculated openly about whether Thomas might have been better off with a proper wife who could have given him sons to help work the land. Now at 32, Eleanor found herself preparing for an auction that would strip away not just her possessions, but her very identity. She moved through the small cabin methodically, touching objects that held memories of better times. The wedding quilt her mother had sewn, now faded but still beautiful. The wooden rocking chair where she'd spent countless evenings mending clothes and dreaming of children who would never come. The small leather-bound journal where she'd recorded her thoughts during the loneliest nights after Thomas's death. As she packed her few personal belongings into a single worn carpet bag, Eleanor reflected on the cruel mathematics of her situation. Thomas's poker debts, outstanding loans from Dalton's bank, unpaid bills to the general store and blacksmith. It all added up to more than the homestead could possibly bring at auction. The land was good, but small, and the cabin needed significant repairs that Thomas had been promising to make for years. In a county where established ranchers controlled thousands of acres, her 40 acres might fetch $60 if she was fortunate. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Even if every stick of furniture and every tool sold for top dollar, she'd still owe money to Marcus Dalton. And in Millfield County, debt wasn't just a financial obligation, it was a chain that bound you to servitude until the last penny was paid. Eleanor had grown up hearing stories of the old days, when indentured, servants worked for years to pay off passage to America. She'd thought such arrangements were relics of a bygone era, but the economic pressures of frontier life had brought them back in new forms. A person could be bound to work for a creditor, their labor valued at subsistence wages until their debt was cleared. For a woman alone, such arrangements often meant years of domestic service in conditions that varied wildly depending on the character of the employer. She'd also heard darker stories, whispered among the women when they thought she wasn't listening. Stories of creditors who specialized in acquiring human contracts, men who viewed desperate people as investments to be bought and sold. The thought made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to confront the reality. Tomorrow she might find herself standing on an auction block, listening to men discuss her worth like she was livestock. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Eleanor's nearest neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Coleman, arrived with a basket of food and an expression of genuine sympathy. Unlike many of the town's women, Sarah had never treated Eleanor's childlessness as a personal failing. Her own struggle to keep her family's farm running after her husband's death in a farming accident had given her a perspective that transcended the community's harsh judgments. "I heard about the notice," Sarah said simply, setting the basket on Eleanor's small kitchen table. "I wish there was something more I could do." Eleanor forced a smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "You've done more than enough, Sarah. Your friendship has meant everything to me. Have you thought about what you'll do after tomorrow, I mean?" The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor had thought of little else for weeks, but every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She had no family to turn to, no savings hidden away, no skills that would allow her to earn enough money to start over somewhere else. In a world where women's opportunities were limited by law and custom, her choices were starkly simple. Find a man willing to marry a barren woman with debts, or accept whatever form of servitude the auction brought. "I suppose I'll find out tomorrow," Eleanor said finally. "The Lord has a plan even when we can't see it." Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she shared Eleanor's doubts about divine providence. They spent the rest of the morning packing Eleanor's belongings and preparing the cabin for the auction. Every task felt like a small death, a severing of connections to the life she'd built with Thomas. When they finally finished, the cabin looked like a museum display, all personal touches removed to make room for potential buyers to envision their own lives within its walls. As afternoon approached, Eleanor found herself drawn to the small garden behind the cabin where she'd spent countless hours coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil. This patch of earth had been her greatest success during the years of her marriage, producing enough food to keep them fed and even provide surplus. To trade at the general store, Thomas had never shown much interest in the garden, viewing it as women's work beneath his attention. But Eleanor had discovered a deep satisfaction in nurturing plants from seed to harvest, in understanding the subtle rhythms of growth and renewal that seemed to mirror life itself. She knelt among the rows of late-season vegetables, her hands automatically pulling weeds and checking for signs of pest damage. The tomatoes were still producing, heavy red globes that hung from sturdy vines she'd carefully trained along wooden stakes. The beans had finished their season, but she'd saved seed for next year's planting, an optimistic gesture that now seemed foolish. Someone else would benefit from her careful selection and preparation. As she worked, Eleanor found herself thinking about the accusations of barrenness that had shadowed her marriage. The community's judgment was based on the simple fact that she'd never conceived during 7 years of marriage to Thomas. But Eleanor had begun to suspect that the problem might not have been entirely hers. Thomas's drinking had grown heavier over the years, and his interest in marital intimacy had waned correspondingly. There had been months when they'd barely shared the same bed, let alone the kind of regular physical relationship that might result in children. But such thoughts were dangerous territory for a woman in her position. Questioning a husband's virility, even silently, was a form of heresy that could destroy what little reputation she had left. Society needed someone to blame for a childless marriage, and convention dictated that the fault lay with the woman. Eleanor had accepted this judgment, partly because she'd had no choice, but also because part of her genuinely wondered if something was wrong with her body. Now, surrounded by the evidence of her ability to nurture life in other forms, she allowed herself to question the assumptions that had defined her for so long. The garden thrived under her care in ways that it never had under Thomas's sporadic attention. The chickens she tended produced more eggs than their neighbors' flocks. Even the milk cow, inherited from Thomas's family, had remained healthy and productive throughout the difficulties of the past year. Perhaps, Eleanor thought as she gathered the last tomatoes of the season, the problem hadn't been her supposed barrenness at all. Perhaps it had been the soil in which she'd been trying to grow. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her musings. Eleanor rose from the garden, brushing dirt from her knees as she watched a lone rider approach the cabin. She recognized the horse before she could make out the rider's face, a sleek bay mare that belonged to the Dalton family. Her heart sank as she realized that Marcus Dalton himself was coming to inspect his investment before tomorrow's auction. Dalton dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to fine horses and expensive clothes. Everything about him spoke of prosperity. The cut of his suit, the shine of his boots, the gold watch chain that gleamed across his vest. He was a handsome man in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about money. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have found him attractive. Under these circumstances, she found him terrifying. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "I trust you received my notice regarding tomorrow's proceedings." "I did, Mr. Dalton." Eleanor kept her voice steady, though her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Excellent. I wanted to discuss the details with you personally, to ensure there are no misunderstandings." He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and extracted several documents. "I've taken the liberty of calculating the probable shortfall based on current property values and outstanding debts." Eleanor's mouth went dry as he spread the papers on her kitchen table, each one covered with neat columns of figures that spelled out her doom in precise mathematical terms. The homestead, in Dalton's estimation, would bring no more than $55 at auction. The livestock and household goods might add another $15 if buyers were generous. Against Thomas's total debts of $127.50, that left a shortfall of nearly $60. "Of course," Dalton continued in the tone of a man discussing the weather, "there are additional costs to consider. Court fees, auctioneer's commission, storage of goods pending sale. I estimate the final amount of your obligation at approximately $75. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. $75 represented more than 2 years' wages for most working women, assuming they could find steady employment. At the rates typically paid for domestic work, she'd be bound to labor for at least 5 years to clear such a debt. "However," Dalton said, his voice taking on a different quality, "I'm prepared to offer you an alternative arrangement." Eleanor looked up sharply, suddenly aware that this conversation had been leading somewhere specific. "What kind of arrangement?" Dalton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've recently acquired a large property north of here, near the border with Clearwater County, a cattle ranch that requires significant development. The previous owner left it somewhat neglected. I'm in need of a capable woman to manage the domestic aspects of the operation, while I oversee the business side. You're offering me employment. More than employment. I'm offering you a chance to work off your debt in a structured environment, with the possibility of earning additional compensation based on the success of the ranch. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. The position would involve managing a large household, supervising other domestic workers, maintaining extensive gardens to feed the ranch hands. It's a role that would suit a woman of your particular talents. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something in Dalton's tone, in the way his gaze lingered on her figure, that suggested this offer came with expectations beyond household management. But what choice did she have? The alternative was to take her chances at tomorrow's auction, where she might end up in far worse circumstances. "What exactly would my obligations be?" she asked carefully. "Complete management of domestic operations. The ranch house is quite large, 12 rooms with quarters for up to 20 workers during peak season. You'd oversee meal preparation, cleaning, laundry, maintenance of the kitchen gardens. In return, you'd receive room and board plus credit against your debt at a rate of $12 per year. $12 per year. At that rate, it would take more than 6 years to clear her obligation, assuming no additional costs were added to her account. 6 years of being bound to Marcus Dalton's service, dependent on his goodwill for the basic necessities of life. The prospect filled her with a dread that went beyond mere financial anxiety. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Eleanor said finally. Dalton's expression hardened slightly. "Time is a luxury you can't afford, Mrs. Mitchell. Tomorrow's auction will proceed regardless of your preference. I'm offering you a chance to avoid the uncertainty of public sale, to know exactly what your future holds. Other bidders might not be so accommodating." The threat was subtle but clear. Eleanor had heard stories about the men who sometimes appeared at debt auctions, buyers who specialized in acquiring human contracts for purposes that weren't discussed in polite society. The frontier was full of isolated places where a woman might disappear entirely, where no one would ask questions about working conditions or personal safety. But as she looked at Dalton's expectant face, Eleanor felt something stirring within her that she hadn't experienced in months. It was anger, clean, bright, and surprisingly powerful. This man sat in her kitchen, in the home she'd shared with her husband, calculating her worth like she was a piece of livestock. He spoke of her particular talents, while his eyes catalogued her body as if he were already planning how to use it. For 7 years, Eleanor had accepted other people's judgments about her value. She'd internalized their assessment of her as a failed woman, broken in some fundamental way. But standing in her thriving garden just minutes earlier, she'd felt a different truth taking root. She wasn't barren, she'd simply been planted in the wrong soil. "Mr. Dalton," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "I appreciate your offer, but I believe I'll take my chances at tomorrow's auction." His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, calculation, and finally a cold anger that made Eleanor step back involuntarily. "That's a very foolish decision, Mrs. Mitchell. I doubt you'll receive a better offer." "Perhaps not, but it will be my choice to make." Dalton gathered his papers with sharp, efficient movements. "Very well, but don't expect any special consideration. Tomorrow, business is business, and debts must be paid." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Eleanor sank into the rocking chair on her front porch, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She just refused what might be her only chance at a tolerable future, choosing instead to gamble everything on the unknown. It was either the bravest or most foolish thing she'd ever done. But as the sun set over the land she'd called home for 7 years, Eleanor Mitchell felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. The fierce satisfaction of making her own choice, regardless of the consequences. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, she was still free to decide her own fate, and somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of grief and self-doubt, a strength she'd forgotten was beginning to remember itself, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of the auction dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees surrounding the town square. Eleanor had barely slept, lying awake in her empty cabin listening to the sounds of the night, and wondering if this would be her last evening of freedom. Now, as she walked the familiar path into Millfield for the final time as a property owner, she carried herself with a dignity that surprised even her. Word of the auction had spread throughout the county with the speed that only scandal could achieve. By the time Eleanor reached the town square, a crowd of nearly 50 people had already gathered around the makeshift platform that Sheriff William Hayes had constructed from wooden crates and planks. The sight of so many familiar faces filled her with a mixture of shame and defiance. These were people who had known her for years, who had watched her marriage and judged her childlessness, and now they had come to witness her final humiliation. But as Eleanor studied the crowd more carefully, she began to distinguish between different types of observers. Near the front stood the town's established families, the Weatherbys who owned the grain mill, the Prescotts who ran the largest general store, and old Judge Hamilton who held court in the hotel's back room twice a month. These people watched the proceedings with the detached interest of those secure in their own positions, curious about the drama, but confident it would never touch their own lives. Behind them clustered the town's working families, people whose own situations were often precarious enough that they understood how quickly circumstances could change. Eleanor caught sight of Mrs. Coleman, the widow who cleaned houses to support her 3 children, and Jacob Murphy, the Irish blacksmith whose thick accent still drew suspicious looks from some of the older residents. These faces showed sympathy rather than judgment, and Eleanor drew strength from their presence, but it was the third group that made her stomach clench with apprehension. Scattered around the edges of the crowd stood several men she didn't recognize, strangers whose expensive clothes and calculating expressions marked them as potential bidders. She spotted Marcus Dalton among them, his face carefully neutral, as he surveyed the assembled crowd like a general assessing a battlefield. Near him stood a thin man with pale eyes and nervous hands who kept consulting a worn leather notebook, and beyond him a heavy-set man in a beaver hat who chewed tobacco and spat with casual precision into the dust. Sheriff Hayes climbed onto the platform and called for attention, his voice carrying easily across the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today for the court-ordered auction of the Mitchell property and effects to satisfy outstanding debts in the amount of $127.50, plus court costs and fees." He pulled out a formal document and began reading the legal language that would transfer ownership of Eleanor's life to the highest bidder. The auction began with the land itself. Eleanor watched in numb fascination as men she'd known for years examined her property like horsemen, evaluating breeding stock. They walked the boundaries, tested the soil, inspected the cabin's foundation and roof. Judge Hamilton made careful notes in a small book, while Marcus Dalton engaged in quiet conversations with several potential buyers. When the bidding finally began, it proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of commerce, each raised hand representing another step in the dissolution of her former life. The land sold for $58 to a young farmer named David Patterson, whose wife stood beside him with their infant son bundled against the cold. Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that the homestead would house another family, that children might finally run through the rooms where she had waited so long for the sound of young voices. Patterson paid Sheriff Hayes immediately, the cash disappearing into an official envelope that would eventually find its way to Eleanor's creditors. Next came the livestock and household goods. Eleanor's milk cow, a gentle Jersey named Buttercup, who had provided faithful service for 5 years, sold to Mrs. Weatherby for $12. The chickens went as a lot for $3 to a teenage boy who loaded their cages onto his father's wagon with obvious excitement. One by one, the physical remnants of Eleanor's married life changed hands, each transaction recorded in Sheriff Hayes's careful script. The household goods followed the same pattern. Her wedding quilt, the one her mother had sewn with such care, and hope, sold to a woman Eleanor didn't recognize for $2. The rocking chair went to old Mrs. Peterson, who had admired it during visits and now acquired it for the price of a store-bought dress. Even Thomas's tools, rusted and worn from years of sporadic use, found buyers among men who needed implements they couldn't afford to purchase new. By noon, the total from all sales had reached $73.25. A sum that left Eleanor owing $54.25, plus the additional court costs and fees that Sheriff Hayes calculated at $6.50. Her final debt stood at $60.75, an amount that represented more than 3 years of wages for most working women. Sheriff Hayes consulted his documents and called for attention once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the matter of the remaining debt. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell owes $60.75, which will be satisfied through a labor contract as authorized by territorial law. Bidding will begin at subsistence wages of $4 per year, with the successful bidder assuming responsibility for room, board, and basic necessities." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, even though she had known this moment was coming. $4 per year meant more than 15 years of bondage, assuming her debt wasn't increased by additional charges for clothing, medical care, or other necessities. She would be approaching 50 by the time she regained her freedom, if she lived that long. Marcus Dalton stepped forward immediately. "I bid $4 per year," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square. The thin man with the notebook raised his hand. $5 per year." "6," came a voice from the back of the crowd, spoken by the heavy-set man in the beaver hat. Eleanor felt the world spinning around her as these strangers negotiated for the right to own her labor, to control every aspect of her life for years to come. She tried to focus on the bidding, to understand what each offer meant for her future, but the voices seemed to come from very far away. $8 per year, Dalton countered, his tone still casual, but his eyes showing the first hint of real. "Interest 10, said the thin man, consulting his notebook as if checking calculations. 12, called out a new voice, one that made every head in the crowd turn in surprise. The speaker was a young man Eleanor had never seen before, tall and well-dressed, but not in the flashy way of the other bidders. He wore working clothes of good quality, leather boots that showed honest wear, a wool coat that was practical rather than fashionable, and a hat that had seen weather but was well maintained. Most surprising of all, he looked to be no more than 25 years old, hardly the sort of person who typically appeared at debt auctions. "I bid $12 per year," he repeated, stepping forward so the crowd could see him clearly. "With additional provisions." Sheriff Hayes frowned. "Additional provisions aren't typically part of these proceedings, Mr. Harrison, James Harrison." The young man's voice was calm, but carried an authority that seemed incongruous with his age. "The additional provisions are a private cottage, rather than quarters in the main house, 2 days off per month for personal business, and the right to maintain a personal garden for her own use." A murmur ran through the crowd. Such terms were virtually unheard of in labor contracts, which typically granted workers only the bare minimum required for survival. Eleanor stared at this James Harrison, trying to understand why a stranger would Offer her conditions that bordered on employment rather than servitude. Marcus Dalton's face had gone dark with anger. $15 per year, he snapped. No additional provisions. James Harrison met his gaze steadily. $18 per year, with the provisions I mentioned. 20. Dalton's composure was beginning to crack, and Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes. At $20 per year, her debt would be cleared in just over 3 years, a significant reduction from the 15-year bondage he had probably been planning. $25 per year, Harrison said quietly, plus the cottage, the time off and the garden. And one more provision. Mrs. Mitchell retains the right to terminate the contract at any time by repaying the remaining balance of her debt. The crowd erupted in surprised conversation. The right to buy out a labor contract was virtually never included in such agreements, since it defeated the purpose of acquiring bound workers. Eleanor felt her heart racing as she tried to process what this young stranger was offering her. $25 per year would clear her debt in less than 3 years, and the right to buy out early meant she wouldn't be trapped if circumstances changed. Sheriff Hayes looked confused by the unusual terms. Mr. Harrison, I need to clarify. Are you certain you understand the nature of these proceedings? A labor contract typically grants the purchaser complete authority over the worker's time and activities. I understand perfectly, Sheriff, Harrison replied. I'm offering Mrs. Mitchell a position as head housekeeper at my family's ranch, with terms that reflect the skilled nature of the work involved. If that's not acceptable to the court, I'm prepared to pay the full debt amount immediately and hire her as a free employee. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled at his words. He was offering to pay her entire debt outright, to free her completely from the legal obligation that had brought her to this auction block. But why? What could possibly motivate a stranger to such generosity? Marcus Dalton's face had gone purple. With rage. This is highly irregular. I protest the terms being offered. Judge Hamilton, who had been watching the proceedings with growing interest, stepped forward. Mr. Dalton, the law requires only that the debt be satisfied and the debtor provided with basic necessities. If Mr. Harrison wishes to offer superior terms, that's his prerogative. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Mitchell, you have the right to accept or reject any offer made here today. What is your decision? Eleanor looked at James Harrison, this young stranger who had just offered her something she had never dared hope for. A chance at dignity, at working conditions that resembled employment rather than slavery. She didn't understand his motives, didn't know anything about him or his family, but she recognized an opportunity that might never come again. I accept Mr. Harrison's offer, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square. Sheriff Hayes made the necessary notations, and Judge Hamilton nodded his approval. The debt is hereby transferred to James Harrison under the terms specified. Mrs. Mitchell, you are bound to fulfill the contract as agreed. As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor found herself standing face to face with the young man who had just purchased her labor. Up close, she could see that he had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. There was something about his bearing that suggested confidence without arrogance, authority without cruelty. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, touching his hat, respectfully. I'm James Harrison. I believe we have a great deal to discuss. Before Eleanor could respond, Marcus Dalton appeared at Harrison's shoulder, his face still flushed with anger. That was quite a performance, boy. I don't know what game you're playing, but don't think this is over. Harrison turned to face the banker, and Eleanor was surprised to see no fear in his expression. Mr. Dalton, I believe our business here is concluded. Mrs. Mitchell is now my employee, and I take the protection of my employees very seriously. Your employee? Dalton laughed harshly. She's your property, boy, bought and paid for. Don't pretty it up with fancy words. The law may say one thing, Harrison replied quietly, "but I know the difference between an employee and property. Mrs. Mitchell will be treated with the respect she deserves." As Dalton stalked away, still muttering threats and complaints, Eleanor found herself studying her new employer with growing curiosity. There was clearly more to James Harrison than met the eye. No ordinary ranch hand could afford to pay $60 and commit to such generous terms. But more intriguingly, he spoke of employees and respect in a way that suggested genuine conviction rather than mere show. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally, "I'm grateful for your intervention, but I have to ask, why? Why would you offer such terms to a complete stranger?" He smiled, and for the first time that day, Eleanor felt something like hope stirring in her chest. "Mrs. Mitchell, I suspect you're going to discover that you're far more valuable than this town ever recognized. My family's ranch has been struggling for years, and I believe you might be exactly what we need to turn things around." As they walked toward his wagon, Eleanor felt the weight of the morning's events settling around her like a new skin. She was no longer Eleanor Mitchell, property owner and widow. She was something new, an employee, a valued worker, a woman whose skills were recognized and compensated fairly. It was a transformation she hadn't dared imagine when she woke that morning, and she found herself curious about what other surprises this young man might have in store. Behind them, the auction platform stood empty, the last remnants of her old life swept away by the afternoon wind. Ahead lay uncertainty, but for the first time in months, it was an uncertainty that held the promise of possibility rather than the certainty of despair. The wagon ride to the Harrison Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, winding through countryside, and that grew progressively more wild and beautiful as they left Millfield behind. Eleanor sat beside James Harrison on the driver's bench, her single carpet bag at her feet and her mind spinning with questions she didn't yet dare ask. The young man seemed content to drive in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or commenting on the changing landscape, but making no effort to satisfy her curiosity about his motives or his family. As they crested a low hill, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of their destination and felt her breath catch in her throat. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across a vast valley like a small town unto itself, dominated by a magnificent 2-story house that dwarfed anything she'd ever seen outside of Kansas City. The main building was constructed of local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that promised cool shade in summer and protection from winter storms. Beyond the house stretched an impressive collection of outbuildings, barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and workshops that spoke of serious ranching operations. But as they drew closer, Eleanor began to notice signs of neglect that troubled her. Paint peeled from porch railings, several windows showed cracked glass, and weeds grew thick around the foundation of what should have been immaculate gardens. The corrals, while sturdy, needed repair work that had obviously been deferred for too long. Most telling of all, she could see very few cattle in the pastures that surrounded the ranch buildings, though the grass showed evidence of much larger herds in recent years. "It's not what it used to be," James said quietly, following her gaze, across the property. "My father built this place over 20 years, turned it into one of the most prosperous operations in 3 counties. But the last few years have been—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Difficult." Eleanor studied his profile as he spoke, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands tightened on the reins. There was clearly more to the story than he was telling, but she sensed this wasn't the time to press for details. Instead, she focused on what she could observe directly. "The bones are good," she said finally. "The buildings, the layout, the land itself, it's all solid. Whatever problems you're facing, they're not with the foundation." James turned to look at her with surprise. "You can tell that just from looking. I've learned to see what matters. Eleanor replied. My late husband was always focused on the grand gestures, the big dreams. I learned to pay attention to the practical details, what works, what doesn't, what can be fixed, and what needs to be started over from scratch. They were approaching the main house now, and Eleanor could see several figures moving around the buildings. An elderly man emerged from the largest barn, walking with the careful gait of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of hard work. Near the house, a woman in a faded dress hung laundry on lines that stretched between tall poles, her movements efficient despite her obvious age. That's Marcus Webb, James said, indicating the man from the barn. He's been with our family since before I was born, knows more about cattle than anyone in the territory. And that's Mrs. Catherine Walsh. She's been trying to keep the house running pretty much single-handed for the past 2 years. As they pulled up to the front of the house, both Webb and Walsh approached the wagon with expressions of curiosity and cautious hope. Eleanor could see intelligence and kindness in their faces, but also the weariness of people who had been working beyond their capacity for too long. "Marcus, Catherine," James said as he climbed down from the wagon, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell. She's going to be taking over as head housekeeper." Catherine Walsh's face showed immediate relief, though she tried to hide it behind polite courtesy. "Mrs. Mitchell, welcome to the Harrison Ranch. I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon with James's assistance, noting how both employees watched the interaction carefully. There was something in their expressions that suggested they'd seen promising developments disappoint them before. "Mrs. Walsh," Eleanor said warmly, "I'm looking forward to learning from your experience. I understand you've been managing quite a responsibility here." The older woman's face softened slightly. "It's been a challenge, I'll admit. The house has 22 rooms, and during roundup season we're feeding up to 30 men 3 times a day. It's more than one person can handle properly. 22 rooms." Eleanor tried to keep her expression neutral, but the scope of the operation was far beyond anything she'd imagined. Her own cabin had consisted of 3 small rooms, and even that had required constant attention to keep clean and organized. Managing a house of this size would require not just hard work, but serious organizational skills and the ability to supervise other workers effectively. "Why don't I show you to your cottage first," James suggested, "and then we can discuss the details of your responsibilities." He led her along a gravel path that wound around the side of the main house, past a kitchen garden that showed signs of recent neglect. Eleanor's experienced eye catalogued the problems automatically: weeds choking out vegetables, fruit trees that needed pruning, herbs that had been allowed to go to seed without proper harvesting. But she also saw potential in the rich soil and the intelligent layout of raised beds and irrigation channels. The cottage that would be her new home sat perhaps 100 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience, but far enough to provide genuine privacy. It was a charming structure of 2 rooms, plus a small kitchen, with windows that looked out over the valley and a front porch just large enough for a rocking chair. Best of all, it appeared to be in excellent repair, with fresh paint and new glass in the windows. "I had the men fix it up last week," James explained as he opened the door for her. "It's been empty for a couple of years, but the structure is sound." Eleanor stepped inside and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunshine. The main room was furnished simply but comfortably, with a stone fireplace, a small dining table, and built-in shelves along one wall. The bedroom contained a proper bed with a new mattress, a wardrobe for clothes, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. The kitchen, while compact, included everything she would need to prepare her own meals: a wood stove, a sink with a hand pump, and cabinets for storage. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "More than I expected." "Good. I want you to be comfortable." "Here." James set her carpet bag on the table and turned to face her directly. Mrs. Mitchell, I think it's time we talked frankly about why I made the offer I did today. Eleanor nodded, settling into one of the chairs and preparing herself for whatever revelation was coming. She'd been wondering about his motives since the moment he'd stepped forward at the auction, and she sensed that the answer would explain a great deal about her new situation. My father, William Harrison, built this ranch from nothing, James began, leaning against the doorframe. He came west after the war with a small stake and a lot of ambition, and over 20 years he turned 40 acres into 4,000. At its peak, we ran 2,000 head of cattle and employed nearly 50 men year-round. What happened? Eleanor asked gently. James's expression darkened. 3 years ago, my father remarried. A woman named Victoria Ashford, 20 years younger than him, and beautiful enough to make him forget everything else. She convinced him that the ranch needed modernizing, that we should expand into new ventures, take on more debt to finance bigger operations. Eleanor began to understand. The debts became unmanageable. Worse than that, Victoria had expensive tastes. She convinced my father to build additions to the house, to buy fancy furniture from back east, to throw elaborate parties for investors, who never materialized. Meanwhile, she was systematically alienating our best workers, driving away the women who had been helping to manage the household operations. Where is she now? Gone. The word carried a weight of bitterness that spoke of recent wounds. My father died 6 months ago, and Victoria discovered that the ranch was mortgaged to the hilt. She took what cash she could find and disappeared, leaving me with debts that total nearly $8,000. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. $8,000 was an almost unimaginable sum, representing decades of careful work, by any normal measure, and Marcus Dalton holds the mortgages. Most of them, yes. He's been circling like a buzzard ever since my father's funeral, waiting for me to miss a payment so he can foreclose on the entire operation. James straightened up, his jaw setting with determination. But I'm not going to let that happen. This ranch can be profitable again. It just needs proper management and someone who understands how to run a large household efficiently. And you think I'm that someone? James smiled for the first time since they'd begun this conversation. Mrs. Mitchell, I spent considerable time making inquiries about you before today's auction. I spoke with Sarah Coleman, with Dr. Hayes, with several of the women who've done business with you over the years. Every single person told me the same thing, that you have a gift for making things grow and thrive, that you can organize complex operations better than anyone they've known. Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks. They said that? Dr. Hayes told me that your kitchen garden produced more food per square foot than any other plot in the county. Sarah Coleman said you could plan and execute a church supper for 100 people, with less waste and better results than a team of experienced cooks. Mrs. Patterson at the general store said you never once failed to deliver goods you'd promised, even when your husband's drinking made life difficult. The validation hit Eleanor like a physical force. For years, she'd internalized the community's judgment that she was somehow deficient, that her inability to bear children marked her as a failed woman. To hear that people had actually noticed and valued her capabilities felt like discovering a treasure she'd never known existed. But that's managing a small household and garden, she protested. This ranch operates on a completely different scale. True, but the principles are the same, aren't they? Planning, organization, attention to detail, understanding what people need to do their best work. The only difference is the size of the operation. Eleanor looked around the cottage again, seeing it now not just as shelter, but as the base of operations for what might be the greatest challenge of her life. What exactly would you expect from me? Complete management of all domestic operations. Meal planning and preparation for the main house and bunkhouses, supervision of cleaning and maintenance, management of the kitchen gardens and dairy operations, coordination with the ranch hands for supplies and equipment. In busy seasons, you'd be responsible for feeding and housing up to 30 men. And the other women, Mrs. Walsh. Catherine is in her 70s and ready to step back from heavy responsibilities, though I hope she'll stay on to help with training and special situations. We have 2 other women who come in part-time for heavy cleaning, but they'll work under your direction. Eleanor felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with a complex organizational challenge. It was the same feeling she'd experienced when planning large church events or figuring out how to make her small garden produce enough food to last through winter, but magnified enormously. The cattle operations, she asked. That's my responsibility, along with Marcus Webb, though I'll expect coordination between the household and ranch sides of the operation, timing meals for roundups, managing supplies, that sort of thing. And if I succeed, if I help make the ranch profitable again, James met her eyes directly, then you'll have proven that you're worth far more than the town of Millfield ever recognized. And you'll have a permanent position here, with wages that reflect your actual value for as long as you want it. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out over the valley that might become her new domain. The scope of the challenge was daunting, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of genuine ambition. This was an opportunity to prove not just to others, but to herself that she was capable of far more than anyone had imagined. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Catherine will show you around the main house and introduce you to the current routines. But Mrs. Mitchell, Eleanor, I want you to know that you have complete authority to make whatever changes you think necessary. This is your operation now." As James left her to settle into her new home, Eleanor unpacked her few belongings and began to plan. Tomorrow, she would begin the greatest challenge of her life, managing an operation that would require every skill she'd ever developed and some she'd yet to discover. But tonight, sitting in her own cottage with the promise of meaningful work ahead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. The deep satisfaction of knowing her life had purpose. Eleanor's first week at the Harrison Ranch unfolded like a masterclass in controlled chaos. Each morning brought new revelations about the true extent of the operation's decline, discoveries that would have overwhelmed her just months earlier, but now sparked a fierce determination to prove herself worthy of James Harrison's unprecedented faith in her abilities. The main house tour with Catherine Walsh had taken nearly 3 hours, revealing room after room that bore witness to both past grandeur and present neglect. The formal dining room could seat 24 guests around a massive mahogany table, but dust sheets covered the chairs and cobwebs draped the crystal chandelier. The library contained hundreds of volumes on ranching, agriculture, and literature, but several shelves had warped from a roof leak that had gone unrepaired for months. Most telling of all was the master suite, where Victoria Ashford's extravagant tastes were still evident in silk wallpaper and imported furniture, now fading and damaged from lack of proper care. She insisted on redecorating everything, Catherine explained as they surveyed a sitting room furnished with delicate chairs that were completely unsuited to ranch life. Mr. William couldn't say no to her, especially after she convinced him that entertaining investors required a certain standard of luxury. Eleanor ran her finger along a windowsill, noting the thick accumulation of dust and the water stains where condensation had damaged the expensive wood. How many people were living in the house when she was here? Just the family and myself. She dismissed the other household staff within her first month, said she wanted to streamline operations, but then she'd host these elaborate dinner parties for strangers who claimed to be potential business partners. Catherine's voice carried years of frustration. I'd spend days preparing for 20 guests, and half the time, only 6 or 7 would actually appear. The financial records told an even more troubling story. Eleanor spent her evenings in the ranch office, a cluttered room where William Harrison had apparently handled all business correspondence in his final years. The account books revealed a pattern of escalating expenses and declining income that painted a picture of systematic financial destruction. Victoria's influence was evident on every page. Invoices for imported champagne, bills for custom-made gowns ordered from New York, payments to decorators and furniture makers that totaled more than most families earned in a year. Meanwhile, essential ranch expenses had been deferred or ignored entirely. Equipment repairs, worker wages, even basic supplies like feed and medicine for the cattle had been treated as secondary priorities, but it was the correspondence that revealed the full scope of the crisis facing James Harrison. Letters from creditors had grown increasingly urgent over the past 6 months, with several threatening immediate action if payments weren't received. Marcus Dalton's bank held mortgages on both the main ranch property and 3 separate parcels of grazing land, with terms that allowed foreclosure if any payment was more than 60 days late. The next major payment was due in just 6 weeks, on the 1st of December. In the amount of $2,400, Eleanor set down the ledger and rubbed her tired eyes, trying to process the mathematics of disaster. Even if the ranch operated at peak efficiency, for the remaining weeks of autumn, there was no realistic way to generate that kind of cash. The current cattle herd numbered fewer than 400 head, and winter prices for beef were traditionally low. James's inheritance consisted largely of debt, infrastructure, and land that was mortgaged beyond its current value. She was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Catherine or one of the part-time workers. Instead, Marcus Webb entered, his weathered hat in his hands and an expression of careful concern on his face. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Mitchell, but I was wondering if we could have a word." "Of course, Mr. Webb. Please sit down." Eleanor gestured to the chair across from the desk, curious about what had prompted the ranch foreman to seek her out. Webb settled into the chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been shaped by decades of physical labor. "I wanted to talk to you about young James," he said without preamble, "about what he's up against and what it might mean for all of us." Eleanor appreciated his directness. "I've been reviewing the financial records. The situation is quite serious. Worse than serious, ma'am. It's desperate." Webb leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I've been with this family since James was in diapers, watched him grow up, taught him everything I know about cattle and land management. He's a good man, smart and hard-working, but he's inherited a situation that would challenge someone with 30 years of experience. What do you think his chances are?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Honestly, without some kind of miracle, he'll lose everything by Christmas. Dalton's been planning this for months, maybe years. He wants this ranch, and he's been positioning himself to take it at a fraction of its real value." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. "What makes you so certain?" "Because I've seen him surveying the property boundaries with other men who don't look like bank officials. Land speculators, most likely, or representatives of the big cattle operations back east. They're planning to break up the ranch and sell it in pieces." The implications hit Eleanor immediately. The Harrison Ranch represented one of the largest independent operations in the region. If it was broken up and sold to large corporate interests, it would mark the beginning of the end for family ranching in the entire county. Smaller operations would find themselves surrounded by corporate neighbors who could undercut prices and monopolize resources. "Does James know about this?" "He suspects, but he's been trying to focus on operational improvements rather than the larger political situation." "That's where you come in, Mrs. Mitchell." Eleanor raised her eyebrows. I'm not sure I understand. Webb smiled for the first time since entering the office. James hired you because he believes you can help turn this place around, make it profitable again. But I think there's more to it than that. I think he sees something in you that most folks have missed, such as leadership, the ability to see the big picture and make things happen. Mrs. Mitchell, I've watched you this past week, seen how you've organized the household operations, how you've started planning improvements to the gardens and dairy. You don't just manage tasks, you understand systems. Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks. Mr. Webb, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm just trying to do the job I was hired for. Are you? Because it seems to me you're doing considerably more than that. Webb pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. This is the supply order you submitted yesterday. Most housekeepers would have simply requested what they needed for immediate operations. But you've planned for expanded operations, calculated bulk purchasing opportunities, even identified ways to reduce waste in the bunkhouse kitchens. Eleanor looked at the paper, seeing her own careful handwriting listing dozens of items with quantities and projected costs. She'd spent hours calculating the most efficient approaches to feeding larger crews during the upcoming roundup season, but she hadn't realized anyone else had noticed the strategic thinking behind her requests. The point is, Webb continued, you're not thinking like an employee. You're thinking like an owner, like someone who has a stake in making this place succeed. And that gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way through this crisis. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of horses approaching the main house drew their attention to the window. Through the darkness, they could see torches bobbing in the distance, and Eleanor counted at least 6 riders making their way up the main road to the ranch. That's trouble, Webb said grimly, rising from his chair. Nobody comes calling after dark unless there's a problem. They moved to the front porch, where James was already waiting, his face tense in the flickering torchlight. Catherine Walsh appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron, and even the ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse to see what was happening. The riders resolved into a group of men Eleanor didn't recognize, led by someone who carried himself with the authority of law enforcement. As they drew closer, she could see badges gleaming on several chests, and her stomach clenched with apprehension. "James Harrison," the leader called out as he dismounted. "I'm Harrison, Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley, Clearwater County. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle theft." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Eleanor heard Catherine gasp, while Marcus Webb stepped protectively closer to James. The young rancher himself showed no visible reaction, though Eleanor could see his hands clenching at his sides. "There's been some mistake, Deputy," James said calmly. "I haven't stolen any cattle." "Maybe not directly," Bradley replied, consulting a document in the torchlight. "But according to our information, you've been selling cattle that carry other ranchers' brands. That's theft under territorial law, regardless of how you came by the animals." Eleanor felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't about actual cattle theft. It was about the complex realities of range management, where cattle from different ranches often mixed during seasonal migrations. Unscrupulous accusers could easily claim that any animal bearing their brand had been stolen, especially if they had cooperative law enforcement. "Who filed the complaint?" James asked. "Marcus Dalton, on behalf of several area ranchers, claims you've been selling their stock through the Kansas City stockyards without permission." Marcus Dalton, of course. Eleanor realized she was witnessing the final phase of a carefully orchestrated plan to destroy James Harrison's ability to operate the ranch. If he was arrested and jailed, even temporarily, he would miss the December mortgage payment. Dalton could then foreclose with clear legal justification, acquiring the property at a fraction of its value. "Deputy Bradley," Eleanor stepped forward, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'm Mrs. Mitchell, the ranch housekeeper." Would it be possible to see the specific accusations? As someone responsible for maintaining ranch records, I might be able to help clarify any misunderstandings. Bradley looked annoyed by the interruption. Ma'am, this is official business. I don't think... Actually, James interrupted, Mrs. Mitchell has been reviewing all our business records as part of her duties. If there are questions about cattle sales, she would be the person most familiar with the documentation. Eleanor felt all eyes turning to her and realized she had just committed herself to a course of action that could determine the fate of everyone on the ranch. She didn't have any special legal knowledge, and she certainly wasn't qualified to challenge law enforcement, but she did have something that might be even more valuable, a detailed understanding of the ranch's operations and the kind of systematic thinking that could identify flaws in an opponent's strategy. Of course, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'd be happy to examine the warrant and supporting documents. As Bradley reluctantly handed over the paperwork, Eleanor realized that this moment represented far more than a legal challenge. It was a test of everything she'd discovered about herself since leaving Millfield, a chance to prove that James Harrison's faith in her abilities had been justified. The papers crackled in the torchlight as she began to read, her mind already working to identify the weaknesses that might save them all. Eleanor's hands remained steady as she examined the warrant by torchlight, though her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a blacksmith's hammer. The document was official enough. Territorial seal, proper signatures, legal language that spoke of cattle bearing specific brands allegedly sold without authorization. But as she read more carefully, her systematic mind began to identify inconsistencies that suggested this was exactly the kind of manufactured crisis Marcus Webb had warned her about. Deputy Bradley, she said, looking up from the papers, these accusations list specific animals sold through the Kansas City stockyards on dates in September and October. Do you have documentation proving these particular cattle originated from the complainant's ranches? Bradley shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, that's not how it works. If cattle bearing a rancher's brand are sold by someone else, that's theft. The burden of proof is on the seller to demonstrate legal ownership. I understand the legal principle, Eleanor replied smoothly, but surely the accusers must provide some evidence that these specific animals were actually theirs. Otherwise, any rancher could claim theft simply by identifying their brand in stockyard records. James watched this exchange with growing amazement. Eleanor was speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to legal procedures, but more than that, she was asking exactly the right questions to expose the weakness in Dalton's strategy. The complainants have provided sworn affidavits, Bradley said defensively, pulling another set of papers from his saddlebag. Eleanor accepted the documents and moved closer to one of the torches for better light. As she read, her expression grew increasingly focused. The affidavits were signed by 4 different ranchers, all claiming that cattle bearing their brands had been illegally sold by James Harrison. But the descriptions were vague, the dates imprecise, and most damning. Of all, the alleged thefts had supposedly occurred during roundup season when legitimate mixing of herds was common. Mr. Harrison, Eleanor said formally, do you have the detailed records of your cattle sales for the periods mentioned in these complaints? Yes, ma'am. Everything's documented in the office ledgers, including bills of sale and transportation. Records. And do those records show the specific brands and markings of animals sold, every single head? It's required by the stockyards for legal sales. Eleanor turned back to Deputy Bradley with the expression that combined politeness with unmistakable authority. Deputy, I believe we can resolve this matter quite simply. The ranch maintains detailed records of all cattle sales, including photographic documentation of brands and markings. If these accusations are accurate, there should be clear evidence in our files. Would you be willing to examine those records before proceeding with the arrest? Bradley looked uncertain for the first time since arriving. The request was reasonable, but Eleanor suspected he'd been counting on the intimidation factor of a nighttime arrest to prevent any serious examination of the evidence. Ma'am, I have my orders. The warrant is valid and— Of course it is, Eleanor interrupted smoothly. But surely a thorough investigation serves everyone's interests. If Mr. Harrison is innocent, examining the records will establish that fact clearly. If he's guilty, the documentation will provide additional evidence for prosecution. Marcus. Webb stepped forward, his weathered face showing new respect for Eleanor's handling of the situation. Deputy, Mrs. Mitchell makes a fair point. And as an officer of the law, you'd want to be certain your case is solid before making an arrest on charges this serious. James nodded slowly, understanding the strategy Eleanor was pursuing. I'm willing to open all our records for examination right now. If there's evidence of wrongdoing, I'll surrender myself voluntarily. Bradley found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Eleanor's reasonable tone and logical arguments made it hard to refuse the request without appearing arbitrary or corrupt. More importantly, the presence of several witnesses meant that any refusal would be remembered and discussed throughout the county. Very well, he said finally, but we'll need to examine everything tonight. I'm not leaving without either making an arrest or satisfying myself that the charges are unfounded. Perfectly acceptable, Eleanor replied. Mr. Harrison, would you please have Marcus bring the cattle sale records from the office? And Catherine, could you prepare coffee for our guests? This may take several hours. As the group moved toward the ranch house, Eleanor felt a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time in her adult life, she was operating from a position of intellectual authority, using skills she'd never fully recognized to protect people who depended on her. The transformation from auction block victim to strategic defender had happened so gradually she hadn't noticed it until this moment of crisis. The ranch office became a makeshift courtroom as Eleanor organized the examination of records with the efficiency of an experienced legal clerk. She spread the cattle sales ledgers across the large desk, arranged supporting documentation in chronological order, and even provided writing materials for the deputies to take notes. Her systematic approach transformed what could have been a chaotic confrontation into a professional review of evidence. Let's begin with the first accusation, Eleanor said, consulting the warrant. Samuel Porter claims that 10 head of cattle bearing his Circle P brand were illegally sold on September 15th. Mr. Harrison, do you have records of cattle sales on that date? James opened the appropriate ledger and found the entries. We sold 27 head on September 15th through the Wichita stockyards. Here's the complete list with brand descriptions. Eleanor examined the entries carefully, then cross-referenced them with Porter's affidavit. According to this documentation, no cattle bearing the Circle P brand were sold on September 15th. The brands listed are Box H, Running W and Lazy S. Deputy Bradley, would you like to verify these entries yourself? Bradley studied the ledger with obvious reluctance, but the evidence was clear. The meticulous record-keeping showed exactly which animals had been sold, with detailed descriptions that didn't match Porter's claims. What about the transportation records? Eleanor asked. Surely the railroad requires documentation for livestock shipments. James produced a file of shipping receipts, each one stamped and signed by railroad officials. The documents confirmed every detail in the ranch ledgers, providing independent verification that no Circle P cattle had been included in the September 15th shipment. Perhaps Mr. Porter was mistaken about the date, Eleanor suggested diplomatically. Shall we examine his other claims? The pattern repeated itself with each accusation. The ranch records were detailed and precise, supported by independent documentation from stockyards and railroads. More importantly, Eleanor's systematic approach revealed discrepancies in the accuser's affidavits that suggested coordination, rather than independent complaints. Deputy Bradley, Eleanor said after they'd reviewed the final accusation, I noticed something interesting about these affidavits. 3 of the 4 complainants claimed their cattle were stolen during the same week in September, but they all described the animals as being in different locations on the ranch. Given that our roundup was completed by September 10th and all cattle were gathered in the main holding pens by that date, these conflicting location descriptions suggest the complainants may not have actually observed the animals they're claiming were stolen. Bradley's face was growing redder by the minute as the fabricated nature of the charges became increasingly obvious. Eleanor's careful analysis had exposed not just the lack of evidence, but the probability that the accusations had been manufactured by people who weren't familiar with the actual operations of the Harrison Ranch. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, the timing of these accusations is rather suspicious. All 4 complaints were filed within days of each other, 6 weeks after the alleged thefts occurred. In my experience, ranchers who discover missing cattle report the thefts immediately, not after substantial delays. James watched Eleanor's performance with growing awe. She was systematically dismantling the case against him with the precision of a master chess player, anticipating objections and cutting off avenues of retreat. More impressively, she was doing it without attacking the accusers directly, maintaining a tone of reasonable inquiry that made her arguments irrefutable. Deputy, Marcus Webb interjected, I've been working cattle in this county for 40 years, and I've never seen more detailed record-keeping than what Mrs. Mitchell has shown you tonight. If young Harrison was stealing cattle, these ledgers would have to be completely falsified. Are you prepared to accuse him of that level of fraud? The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. To pursue the charges now, Bradley would have to argue that an elaborate conspiracy existed to falsify multiple sets of independently verified records. The idea was not only implausible, but would require investigation resources that the county couldn't afford to commit. Mrs. Mitchell, one of the other deputies said quietly, you seem mighty knowledgeable about legal procedures for a housekeeper. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I've learned that understanding systems and procedures is essential for managing complex operations, whether it's running a large household or examining business records. The principles of careful documentation and logical analysis apply everywhere, but privately, Eleanor was amazed by her own performance. Some deep part of her mind had taken control during this crisis, drawing on intellectual capabilities she'd never fully tested. The systematic thinking that had made her successful at managing gardens and organizing church events had proved equally effective at legal analysis and strategic defense. I believe we're finished here, Deputy Bradley said finally, his voice tight with frustration. The evidence doesn't support the charges as filed. What happens now? James asked. I'll file a report stating that the accusations couldn't be substantiated based on available evidence. The complainants can pursue the matter further if they choose, but they'll need to provide substantially better documentation. As the deputies prepared to leave, Eleanor felt a moment of sympathy for Bradley. He was clearly an honest man who'd been manipulated into serving someone else's agenda, and she suspected he was beginning to realize how he'd been used. Deputy, she said quietly as he mounted his horse, I hope you'll remember that not all accusations are based on fact, especially when they serve someone's financial interests. Bradley nodded grimly. I'll remember, ma'am, and I'll be asking harder questions before I serve warrants in the future. After the law enforcement party disappeared into the darkness, the ranch hands gathered around James and Eleanor with expressions of amazement and relief. Catherine Walsh was the first to speak. Mrs. Mitchell, that was the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed. You saved Mr. James from jail and probably saved all our jobs in the process." Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks, but also a deep satisfaction that was entirely new to her experience. "I just applied the same principles I use for any complex problem: careful examination of facts, logical analysis, and systematic thinking." "It was brilliant," James said simply. "You didn't just defend me, you exposed the entire conspiracy and made it impossible for them to try this approach again." Marcus Webb nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've seen lawyers who couldn't have handled that situation half as well. You've got a gift for this kind of work." As the group dispersed and normal nighttime quiet returned to the ranch, Eleanor found herself alone with James on the front porch. The crisis was over, but its implications would ripple through everything that followed. "Eleanor," James said, using her first name for the first time since her arrival, "what you did tonight went far beyond anything I had the right to expect from an employee. You probably saved the ranch." "I did what needed to be done," Eleanor replied. But she could hear the pride in her own voice. "And I discovered something about myself that I never knew existed." "What's that?" Eleanor looked out over the dark valley that was rapidly becoming home to her in ways she'd never experienced before. "That I'm not broken or deficient or barren. I'm just a woman who was never given the chance to discover what she was truly capable of achieving." The admission hung in the night air like a promise, a declaration that the woman who had stood on an auction block just weeks earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who was finally beginning to understand her own worth. The autumn morning air carried the crisp promise of winter as Eleanor stood in the kitchen garden, surveying the results of 3 weeks' intensive planning and preparation. What had been a neglected patch of weeds and struggling vegetables when she arrived had transformed into something approaching agricultural artistry. Neat rows of late-season crops stretched toward the distant mountains, while newly constructed cold frames promised fresh vegetables throughout the winter months. But the garden was only the most visible symbol of the systematic transformation Eleanor had orchestrated throughout the ranch operations. Her morning routine now began at dawn, with a review of detailed schedules that coordinated every aspect of domestic operations: meal planning for varying numbers of workers, supply ordering that maximized bulk purchasing advantages, and maintenance. Schedules that prevented small problems from becoming expensive repairs. The success was already showing in the ranch's operational costs. Food expenses had dropped by nearly 30% through careful meal planning and reduced waste, while the expanded kitchen garden was producing enough surplus vegetables to trade for goods the ranch couldn't produce internally. More importantly, the improved efficiency had freed up resources and labor that James could redirect toward the critical work of rebuilding the cattle operation. Eleanor was examining the progress of her winter lettuce experiment when she heard familiar footsteps approaching along the gravel path. James had developed a habit of checking on the garden operations during his morning rounds, but today his expression carried an urgency that immediately put her on alert. "Eleanor, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "I've received some information that changes everything we thought we knew about our situation." She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "What kind of information?" "The kind that explains why Dalton has been so determined to acquire this ranch, and why he was willing to risk manufactured criminal charges to accelerate the foreclosure process." James glanced around the garden, then toward the main house. "This isn't a conversation for outdoors. Can you meet me in the office in an hour?" Eleanor nodded, noting the tension in his voice and the way his eyes kept scanning the horizon as if watching for unwelcome visitors. "Should I ask Catherine to prepare anything special? Coffee, food for guests?" "No guests. This is just between us, and maybe Marcus if I decide his experience would be helpful." James paused, studying her face carefully. "Eleanor, what I'm about To share with you will require the same kind of strategic thinking you demonstrated during the arrest situation. But the stakes are much higher, and the decisions we make could affect not just this ranch, but the entire future of independent ranching in this region. An hour later, Eleanor sat across from James in the ranch office, watching him spread a collection of maps and documents across the large desk. Some of the papers were official territorial surveys, others appeared to be hand-drawn sketches with notes in margins. All of them seemed to focus on the geographic area surrounding the Harrison Ranch. 2 days ago, I received a visit from Thomas Brennan, James began, the Territorial Land Commissioner. He's an old friend of my father's, and he came here specifically to warn me about something he'd discovered during routine filing reviews. Eleanor leaned forward, intrigued by the serious tone in James's voice. What did he find? Applications for mineral rights surveys covering most of Clearwater County, including this ranch and virtually every other significant property in the area. The applications were all filed by the same company, Mountain West Development Corporation, and they're all dated within the past 6 months. The implications hit Eleanor immediately. They're looking for mineral deposits, gold, silver, maybe coal or copper. Exactly, but here's what makes it interesting. Mountain West Development Corporation is a shell company. When Brennan tried to trace the actual ownership, he discovered that the controlling interest belongs to Marcus Dalton and 2 partners from back east. Eleanor felt pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place in her mind. So, Dalton isn't just trying to acquire ranching properties. He's betting that there are valuable mineral deposits underneath the land. More than betting. According to Brennan, preliminary surveys have already been conducted on several properties, apparently without the knowledge of the current owners. They've been using territorial survey crews that have legitimate reasons to access private land, but conducting mineral assessments while they're supposedly doing routine boundary work. James pulled out one of the hand-drawn maps and pointed to several locations marked with small symbols. These are the sites where they've found promising indicators. Gold traces in creek beds, rock formations that suggest possible silver deposits, coal seams that could support industrial mining operations. Eleanor studied the map carefully, her systematic mind automatically analyzing the pattern of marked locations. How many of these sites are on your property? At least 3, possibly more. The creek that runs through our northeast pasture shows significant gold traces, and there's a hill formation near the old line cabin that apparently has the right geological characteristics for silver deposits. The magnitude of what James was revealing slowly sank in. If the Harrison Ranch contained valuable mineral deposits, its true worth could be hundreds of times greater than its value as agricultural land. But more importantly, anyone who knew about these deposits and acquired the land cheaply could potentially become enormously wealthy. This explains everything, Eleanor said slowly. Dalton's willingness to extend credit to your father, even when the ranch was struggling. His determination to foreclose quickly when your father died, the manufactured cattle theft charges designed to force immediate default on the mortgage payments. And Victoria, James added grimly, I'm beginning to suspect her involvement with... My father wasn't coincidental. Her expensive tastes and extravagant spending patterns were perfectly designed to drive the ranch into debt quickly. Eleanor felt a chill as she considered the implications. You think she was working with Dalton from the beginning? It would explain a lot. How she convinced my father to take on debt specifically with Dalton's bank. Why her spending increased so dramatically after their marriage. Even her sudden departure after my father's death. If she'd accomplished her mission of driving the ranch to the edge of bankruptcy, her work was done. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Eleanor tried to process the idea that James's family had been systematically destroyed as part of a calculated plan to acquire land for mineral development. The personal betrayal involved was almost beyond comprehension. "What does this mean for our current situation?" she asked. James leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "On one hand, it means the ranch is potentially worth far more than we ever imagined. On the other hand, it means we're up against opponents with much more at stake than simple real estate speculation. If Dalton and his partners believe they can extract hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of minerals from this land, they're not going to give up easily. But surely this information changes your legal position. If you can prove that the loans were made under false pretenses, or that Victoria was acting as Dalton's agent, maybe. But proving conspiracy would require legal resources we don't have and time we can't afford. The December payment is still due in less than 4 weeks, and we still don't have the cash to make it." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out over the ranch buildings and pastures with new understanding. Everything she could see, the careful layout of buildings, the strategic positioning of water sources, the natural barriers that made the property easy to defend, had been planned by someone who understood land management intimately. But underneath it all lay potential wealth that could transform not just individual lives, but the entire economic structure of the region. "There might be another approach," she said finally, turning back to face James. "What if instead of trying to fight Dalton's foreclosure, we beat him at his own game?" James raised his eyebrows. "I'm not sure I follow." Eleanor returned to the desk and studied the mineral survey maps more carefully. "Dalton's strategy depends on acquiring this land cheaply and then developing the mineral rights himself. But what if we develop those rights first? Eleanor, mineral development requires enormous capital investment. We're talking about mining equipment, processing facilities, transportation infrastructure. Even if we had legitimate mineral deposits, we couldn't possibly afford to develop them. Not by ourselves, Eleanor agreed. But what if we found partners who could provide the capital in exchange for a share of the profits? Partners who would be willing to pay us enough upfront to clear the current debts and provide operating capital for the ranch. James stared at her, and Eleanor could see his mind working through the implications of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about forming our own development company." "Exactly. If these mineral deposits are as valuable as the surveys suggest, there would be legitimate investors willing to partner with us. People who would prefer to work with the current landowners, rather than wait for Dalton's foreclosure and try to negotiate with him. But we don't have any experience with mineral development, any connections in that industry." Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar surge of excitement that came with a complex organizational challenge. "No, but we have something Dalton doesn't. Expect us to have advanced knowledge of his strategy and detailed information about the mineral deposits he's trying to acquire." She pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching a rough organizational chart. "What if we contacted Thomas Brennan and asked him to quietly identify potential investors who might be interested in a mineral development partnership? People who understand the industry but aren't connected to Dalton's network? That's incredibly risky. If we're wrong about the mineral values, or if we can't find suitable partners, then we're no worse off than we are now," Eleanor interrupted. "James, you're going to lose this ranch in 4 weeks unless we find a way to raise $2,400. Traditional ranching operations can't generate that kind of money in such a short time. But if we're sitting on top of mineral deposits worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, then we have an asset we can leverage." James walked to the window and stared out at the land his father had spent 20 years building into a successful ranch. Eleanor could see the conflict in his posture, the desire to preserve his family's legacy, warring with the recognition that dramatic action might be their only hope for survival. "There's another consideration," Eleanor said quietly. "If Dalton succeeds in foreclosing on this ranch and develops the mineral rights himself, what happens to all the other independent ranchers in the county? How long before he starts manufacturing reasons to foreclose on their properties too? The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor understood that she was asking James to risk everything on a strategy that could either save the ranch or destroy it completely. But she also understood that doing nothing guaranteed destruction, while taking action at least offered the possibility of victory. "You really think we could pull this off?" James asked finally. Eleanor looked around the office, seeing not just the immediate crisis of debt and foreclosure, but the larger pattern of systematic transformation she'd been orchestrating since her arrival. "James, 3 weeks ago you hired a woman who was considered worthless by her entire community. Since then, she's reorganized your household operations, saved you from false criminal charges, and developed a strategic plan that could turn the tables on your enemies completely. Your point being? My point being that sometimes the most valuable resources are the ones that nobody else recognizes. Dalton thinks he's dealing with a failing ranch run by an inexperienced young man. He has no idea that he's actually up against a partnership that combines your knowledge of land and cattle with my skills in organization and strategic planning." James turned back to face her, and Eleanor could see decision crystallizing in his expression. "What do you need from me?" "Complete authority to negotiate with potential partners, access to all the financial records and property documentation, and your promise that you'll trust my judgment even when the decisions seem risky." "You have it." James extended his hand. "Across the desk." "Partners!" Eleanor clasped his hand firmly, feeling the callous strength of someone who'd worked with cattle and horses all his life. "Partners. Now let's go save your ranch and change the future of this entire county." As they shook hands, Eleanor felt the final pieces of her transformation clicking into place. The woman who had stood on an auction block just months earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who was finally beginning to understand the true scope of her own capabilities. The game was about to change, and she intended to make sure they were the ones controlling the rules. The private dining room at the Continental Hotel in Denver buzzed with the kind of quiet tension that accompanied high-stakes business negotiations. Eleanor sat at the polished mahogany table, her simple but well-tailored dress a sharp contrast to the expensive suits worn by the 3 men across from her. To her left, James maintained the calm demeanor of a seasoned rancher, though she could see the slight tension in his hands as he reviewed the documents spread before them. 2 weeks had passed since their decision to pursue mineral development. Partnerships. 2 weeks of frantic correspondence and careful planning that had led to this moment. Thomas Brennan had proved invaluable in identifying potential investors who operated outside of Marcus Dalton's sphere of influence, and Eleanor's carefully crafted letters had succeeded in attracting serious interest from established mining operations. Now she faced the most important negotiation of her life, one that would determine not just the fate of the Harrison Ranch, but her own future as well. The 3 investors, Harrison Clark from Chicago, Benjamin Rothschild from St. Louis, and David McConnell from San Francisco, represented different but complementary aspects of mineral development expertise. Clark specialized in gold extraction. Rothschild had extensive experience with silver mining operations, and McConnell's company had pioneered efficient coal extraction techniques. "Mrs. Mitchell," Clark said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to major financial decisions, "your preliminary reports are certainly intriguing, but I have to say, the timeline you're proposing is extremely aggressive. Mineral development typically requires months or even years of careful surveying before any significant investment can be justified." Eleanor had anticipated this objection and was prepared with a response that she'd refined through days of practice. "Mr. Clark, you're absolutely correct under normal circumstances, but our situation is unique in several respects. First, we have access to detailed geological surveys that have already been conducted without our knowledge. Second, we're offering partnership terms that provide immediate access to proven deposits rather than speculative exploration rights. She opened her leather portfolio and extracted copies of the survey maps that Thomas Brennan had provided, spreading them across the table where all three investors could examine them carefully. These surveys were conducted by Mountain West Development Corporation using territorial survey crews. The data is legitimate and comprehensive, even though it was obtained through questionable methods. Rothschild studied the maps with the practiced eye of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of potential mining sites. The silver indicators are particularly promising, he admitted. These geological formations are consistent with some of the richest deposits we've developed in Colorado and Nevada. And the gold traces in the creek systems suggest placer deposits that could be profitable with relatively modest initial investment, McConnell added, running his finger along the waterways marked on the survey. The real question is whether we can establish legitimate claims and begin operations before your competitors realize what's happening. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the confident tone she'd discovered during the legal crisis weeks earlier. Gentlemen, that's exactly where our partnership offers unique advantages. We own the land outright, or will, once we satisfy the current mortgage obligations. Mountain West Development Corporation has been assuming they can acquire these properties through foreclosure and then file mineral claims without competition. They have no idea that we're aware of their strategy or that we're prepared to beat them to the Territorial Land Office. James spoke up for the first time in several minutes. The legal framework strongly favors existing landowners who file mineral development claims. As long as we can demonstrate good faith efforts to develop the resources, we have priority over any subsequent claims filed by other parties. Even if those parties are better capitalized, Clark asked. Especially then, Eleanor replied. Territorial law was specifically designed to prevent large corporations from monopolizing mineral rights by outspending smaller operators. The key requirement is demonstrating active development within 6 months of filing claims. Rothschild set down the survey documents and regarded Eleanor with newfound respect. Mrs. Mitchell, you seem remarkably well informed about mining law for someone whose background is in household management. Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar surge of confidence that came with demonstrating competence in unexpected areas. Mr. Rothschild, I've discovered that the principles of careful research and systematic analysis apply to many different fields. When the stakes are this high, ignorance is a luxury we couldn't afford. The truth was that Eleanor had spent every evening for the past 2 weeks studying territorial mining regulations, corresponding with legal experts, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. Her approach combined the meticulous attention to detail she'd always applied to domestic operations with the strategic thinking she'd discovered during the recent crisis. Let's discuss the specific terms you're proposing, McConnell said, pulling out a notebook where he'd apparently been making calculations. You're asking for immediate payment of $50,000 in exchange for a 60% partnership interest in all mineral development rights. That's a substantial premium over typical exploration investments. Eleanor had expected this negotiation point and was ready with a comprehensive response. Mr. McConnell, our proposal reflects several factors that distinguish this opportunity from typical mineral investments. First, you're acquiring partnership rights to proven deposits rather than paying for speculative exploration. Second, you're gaining access to detailed geological data that would normally cost tens of thousands of dollars to develop independently. She paused, letting the financial implications sink in before continuing. Most importantly, you're preventing a well-capitalized competitor from acquiring the same resources through foreclosure proceedings. Mountain West Development Corporation has been planning to acquire these properties for less than $10,000 total. Our partnership allows you to secure the same assets for a fraction of what you'd pay in a competitive bidding situation. James nodded approvingly. And we're offering something that most mineral partnerships don't include: complete operational control of the surface operations. The ranch will continue functioning as a cattle operation, providing supplementary income and ensuring that the partnership has diversified revenue streams. Clark consulted his own notes, then looked up with an expression of grudging admiration. You've clearly thought through the financial implications carefully, but I have to ask, what makes you confident that you can successfully manage complex mining operations when you have no direct experience in the industry? The question struck at Eleanor's deepest remaining insecurity, the lingering doubt about whether her abilities could translate to challenges this far outside her previous experience. But as she looked around the table at these successful businessmen who were taking her proposals seriously, she felt the same clarity that had guided her through every crisis since leaving Millfield. "Mr. Clark," she said quietly, "6 months ago, I was considered a worthless woman whose only value was as unpaid domestic labor. Today, I'm sitting in a Denver hotel negotiating a $50,000 business partnership with some of the most successful mining investors in the Western Territories. I've learned not to underestimate what's possible when someone is properly motivated and given the resources to succeed." The room fell silent for a long moment. Eleanor could see the 3 investors exchanging glances, conducting some form of silent communication that she couldn't interpret. Finally, Rothschild spoke for the group. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've been involved in dozens of mining partnerships over the years, and we've learned to evaluate not just the geological potential, but the human element that determines whether projects succeed or fail. What we see in you is something quite rare, the combination of analytical intelligence, strategic thinking, and absolute determination that characterizes the most successful entrepreneurs we've worked with." Eleanor felt her heart hammering, but kept her expression neutral as Rothschild continued. "However, $50,000 represents a substantial investment, and we need assurance that you understand the full scope of what you're proposing. Mining operations involve complex logistical challenges, significant safety considerations, and regulatory requirements that can be quite different from ranch management." "We understand that," James replied. "That's why we're proposing a partnership rather than attempting to develop the resources independently. We're offering local knowledge, property control, and operational management, while you provide the technical expertise and capital investment that we lack." McConnell leaned back in his chair, studying Eleanor with the calculating gaze of someone making a final assessment. "There's one more factor we need to discuss. If we proceed with this partnership, Mountain West Development Corporation is going to realize very quickly that their acquisition strategy has been compromised. Marcus Dalton strikes me as the kind of man who doesn't accept defeat gracefully." Eleanor had been expecting this concern and was ready with an answer. "Mr. McConnell, we're already targets of Dalton's efforts to acquire our property. The choice isn't between safety and risk, it's between passive victim and active resistance. At least this way, we have the resources to fight back effectively. And legal protection," James added. "Once we file the mineral development claims and establish the partnership, any efforts to interfere with our operations become federal crimes rather than local civil matters. Dalton's influence with county officials won't help him against territorial marshals." Clark nodded slowly. "That's a valid point. Federal jurisdiction changes the game considerably." The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical details about extraction methods, transportation logistics, and profit-sharing arrangements. Eleanor found herself contributing substantively to discussions about subjects she'd never encountered before, her systematic approach to problem-solving proving surprisingly applicable to industrial planning. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade through the hotel's tall windows, the three investors requested a private consultation. Eleanor and James stepped onto the hotel's covered balcony, where they could see the bustling activity of Denver's commercial district stretching toward the distant mountains. "Do you think they'll agree to the partnership?" James asked quietly. Eleanor watched a freight wagon loaded with mining equipment rumble past on the street below. "I think they're going to say yes, but probably with modifications to our proposed terms. They're serious businessmen who recognize a good opportunity, but they're also going to want additional protections for their investment." "Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor smiled, feeling the calm confidence that had carried her through every challenge since leaving the auction block in Millfield. "James, I spent 20 minutes in that room discussing the optimal placement of processing equipment for silver extraction, even though I'd never heard of such equipment until 2 weeks ago. I think I can handle whatever modifications they propose." When they returned to the dining room, Clark spoke for the group, with the formal tone that marked important business decisions. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Harrison, we're prepared to move forward with the partnership under modified terms. $45,000 immediate payment for a 55% partnership interest with additional performance bonuses based on production milestones." Eleanor felt a surge of triumph, but kept her expression businesslike as she replied, "Gentlemen, we accept your terms. When can we expect the initial payment?" "The funds will be transferred to your designated bank within 1 week," Rothschild replied, "but we'll need to move very quickly on filing the mineral claims. How soon can you return to the ranch and begin the necessary legal procedures?" "We can leave Denver tomorrow morning," James said, "and we should be able to file the claims within 3 days of returning." As they finalized the details and signed the preliminary agreements, Eleanor felt the weight of transformation settling around her like a new identity. The woman who had been sold to pay her husband's debts had just negotiated one of the largest business deals in the territory's recent history. More importantly, she'd done it using skills and intelligence that no one, including herself, had ever recognized or valued. Walking back to their hotel that evening, Eleanor and James moved through Denver's gaslit streets with the careful composure of people carrying momentous news. The partnership agreement in Eleanor's portfolio represented more than financial salvation. It was proof that the systematic destruction Marcus Dalton had planned could be not just prevented, but turned into the foundation for unprecedented success. "Eleanor," James said as they reached their hotel, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him curiously, noting an unusual formality in his tone. "When this partnership succeeds, and it will succeed, you're going to be one of the wealthiest women in the territory, independent wealth that no one can take away from you ever again." Eleanor felt the full implications of his words settling into her consciousness. Financial independence meant freedom to make choices based on desire rather than necessity, security that would allow her to take risks and pursue opportunities that had been unimaginable just months earlier. "James," she replied quietly, 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Tomorrow we're going to change the economic future of an entire county. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what I was actually meant to accomplish in this world." As they entered the hotel lobby, Eleanor caught her reflection in the mirror beside the front desk. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the defeated figure who had stood on an auction block in Millfield. This woman carried herself with the confidence of someone who understood her own worth, someone who had learned to transform challenges into opportunities and obstacles into stepping stones toward unprecedented achievement. The territorial land office in Colorado Springs had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the crisp November morning when Eleanor Mitchell and James Harrison arrived to file their mineral development claims. Eleanor stepped down from their hired carriage, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that spoke of prosperity and purpose, her leather satchel containing documents that would reshape the economic landscape of Clearwater County forever. Behind them, Marcus Dalton's carriage pulled up with the sharp efficiency of someone who had expected to conduct routine business, only to discover that his carefully orchestrated plans were about to collapse spectacularly. Eleanor watched him emerge from his vehicle with two well-dressed companions, his face showing the first flickers of uncertainty as he realized that his intended victims had somehow arrived ahead of him. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the busy street with false cordiality. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you so far from home. I trust you're enjoying your employment with young Harrison?" Eleanor turned to face him with the calm composure of someone who held all the advantages in an approaching confrontation. "Mr. Dalton, I'm here on business matters that I believe will be of considerable interest to you. I understand you've been planning to file mineral development claims in Clearwater County." The color drained from Dalton's face as the implications of her words hit him. Eleanor could see him rapidly calculating how she could possibly know about his secret plans and what her presence at the land office might mean for his carefully laid strategy. "I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Of course not," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Just as I'm sure you have no knowledge of the Mountain West Development Corporation or the geological surveys that have been conducted on private property without the owner's consent." Dalton's two companions exchanged worried glances, clearly recognizing that their covert operations had been exposed. Eleanor had spent considerable time researching the backgrounds of Dalton's Eastern partners, and she knew that any hint of legal impropriety could destroy their ability to secure additional investment capital. "Mrs. Mitchell, one of the Eastern men said, stepping forward with the smooth manner of someone accustomed to difficult negotiations. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately? I'm sure we can reach some mutually beneficial arrangement." Eleanor's smile carried the cold precision of someone who had learned to use knowledge as a weapon. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary, Mr. Ashworth. You see, we've already reached our own arrangements for developing the mineral resources of the Harrison Ranch." She opened her satchel and extracted the preliminary partnership agreement signed in Denver, spreading them on the hood of their carriage, where Dalton and his associates could see the official letterhead and legal seals. "Harrison, Clark, and Associates will be filing comprehensive development claims this morning, covering all mineral rights on the Harrison property and several adjacent parcels." The effect was immediate and devastating. Dalton stared at the documents as if they were instruments of his own execution, while his Eastern partners began urgent whispered conversations about the legal implications of Eleanor's preemptive move. "This is impossible," Dalton said finally, his voice hoarse with shock. "You don't have the capital for this kind of development. You're facing foreclosure in 2 weeks. "We're facing foreclosure," Eleanor corrected gently. "Mr. Harrison received a substantial advance payment from his mineral development partners yesterday. The December mortgage payment has already been transferred to your bank, along with enough additional funds to bring all accounts current." The revelation hit Dalton like a physical blow. Eleanor could see him struggling to process the complete reversal of his expectations, the transformation of certain victory into absolute defeat. His entire strategy had depended on acquiring the Harrison property through foreclosure, and that Foundation had just crumbled beneath him. But even if you've satisfied the immediate debt, one of his partners said desperately, you still can't prevent us from filing competing claims on adjacent properties. James spoke for the first time since their arrival, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to recognize his own strength. Actually, we can. Mrs. Mitchell has spent the past month identifying and contacting the owners of every significant property in the county. Most of them are quite interested in forming development partnerships that would protect them from hostile acquisition attempts. Eleanor nodded approvingly. It had been one of her most complex organizational challenges, coordinating simultaneous negotiations with dozens of property owners while maintaining absolute secrecy about the larger strategy. But the systematic approach that had made her successful at managing household operations had proved equally effective at orchestrating county-wide economic transformation. The Wilson Ranch, the Patterson Homestead, the Miller grazing lands, all of them have signed preliminary agreements for mineral development partnerships that will be formalized within the next 30 days, she continued. By Christmas, nearly 60% of the county's private land will be protected by legitimate development claims that take priority over any subsequent filings. The scope of Eleanor's counter-strategy was becoming clear to Dalton and his associates. She hadn't simply defended one property, she had systematically organized the entire county's property owners into a coordinated resistance that made their acquisition plan impossible to execute. "This is preposterous," Dalton exploded, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. "You're a domestic servant with no business experience, no legal training, no understanding of complex financial operations. You can't possibly have orchestrated something this sophisticated." Eleanor looked at him with the pitying expression of someone observing a man who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his opponent. "Mr. Dalton, that's exactly the kind of thinking that made your defeat inevitable. You assumed that because I was sold at auction to pay debts, I must be worthless. You never considered that you might be facing someone with capabilities you'd never bothered to recognize." She stepped closer to him, her voice taking on the steel edge that had emerged. "During every crisis she'd faced since leaving Millfield, you saw a barren woman whose husband's gambling had reduced her to servitude. What you failed to see was someone with the organizational skills to coordinate complex operations, the analytical intelligence to understand legal and financial systems, and the strategic thinking to turn your own weapons against you." Dalton's face was purple with rage and humiliation. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" "I have connections throughout the territory, political influence that can destroy any business you try to establish." "Had connections," Eleanor corrected. "Mr. Rothschild's investigation revealed some very interesting information about your financial arrangements with territorial officials. It seems that several of your political allies are quite eager to distance themselves from Mountain West Development Corporation, especially now that federal investigators are examining the legality of your geological surveys." The final blow landed with devastating precision. Eleanor had learned from her Denver partners that corruption in territorial land management was a federal concern, and she'd made sure that the appropriate authorities received detailed information about Dalton's unauthorized survey activities. "Federal investigators," one of Dalton's partners asked, his voice tight with panic. "Unauthorized surveys on private property constitute theft of intellectual property under federal law," James explained, "especially when conducted as part of a conspiracy to defraud property owners of their mineral rights." Eleanor watched with satisfaction as Dalton's eastern partners began backing away from him, clearly unwilling to risk federal prosecution for the sake of a failed land acquisition scheme. The coalition that had seemed so powerful just minutes earlier was dissolving under the pressure of legal accountability. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dalton said, his voice now carrying a note of desperate pleading, "surely we can reach some accommodation. I'm prepared to offer very generous terms for a partnership arrangement." "Mr. Dalton," Eleanor replied with finality, "6 months ago you could have offered me honest employment at fair wages, and I would have been grateful for the opportunity. Today, you're facing financial ruin and possible federal prosecution, while I'm about to become one of the wealthiest women in the territory. I believe that demonstrates the consequences of underestimating people based on their circumstances, rather than their capabilities." As Dalton and his disintegrating coalition retreated toward their carriages, Eleanor and James entered the territorial land office to complete the legal formalities that would secure their mineral claims. The clerk who processed their paperwork seemed impressed by the comprehensive nature of their filings, and the substantial fees they paid demonstrated the serious financial backing behind their development plans. Walking back to their carriage, an hour later, Eleanor felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had not merely survived a systematic attempt at destruction, but had transformed that attack into the foundation for unprecedented success. The Mineral Development Partnership would generate wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined, but more importantly, it represented proof that her worth had never been determined by other people's limitations. "Eleanor," James said as they prepared to begin the journey back to the ranch, "there's something I need to ask you." She looked at him curiously, noting an unusual formality in his expression. "When we started this partnership, it was born out of necessity. You needed employment, and I needed someone with your organizational skills. But somewhere along the way, it became something much more important to me." Eleanor felt her heart accelerating as she recognized the direction of his words. "You've proven that you're not just my business partner, but someone I want as my life partner. Eleanor Mitchell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal came as no surprise. Eleanor had sensed the deepening emotional connection between them as they'd worked together to save the ranch and build their mineral development empire. But hearing the words spoken aloud filled her with a joy that transcended even her business successes. "James Harrison," she replied, "6 months ago I was sold at auction because I was considered barren and worthless. Today I'm a successful businesswoman who's about to become your wife by choice rather than necessity. Yes, I will marry you, but not because I need your protection or support. I'll marry you because I choose to build a life with someone who recognizes my worth." As their carriage rolled through the Colorado countryside toward home, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had brought her from the auction block in Millfield to partnership in one of the territory's most promising business ventures. The woman who had been considered a failure because she couldn't bear children had discovered that her true gift lay in nurturing ideas, organizations, and opportunities into flourishing realities. 6 months later, Eleanor Harrison stood on the front porch of the greatly expanded ranch house, watching the controlled chaos of a mining operation that employed over 200 workers and generated profits that exceeded the wildest dreams of anyone in Clearwater County. The kitchen gardens that had been her first success at the ranch had grown into agricultural operations that supplied fresh food to 3 mining camps, while the organizational systems she'd developed for household management had been scaled up to coordinate complex industrial operations. But the transformation that meant the most to her was visible in the faces of the women who now worked in various capacities throughout the expanded operation. Former domestic servants had become supervisors and coordinators, their capabilities finally recognized and fairly compensated. The message was spreading throughout the territory that Eleanor Harrison's enterprises offered opportunities for women to discover and develop their true potential. As the sun set over the mountains that had yielded their mineral treasures to careful planning and systematic development, Eleanor placed her hand on her rounded belly, where the child she carried grew strong and healthy. The doctors had finally identified the medical condition that had prevented her previous pregnancies, a treatable issue that improved nutrition and reduced stress had gradually corrected. James emerged from the mining office, his face showing the satisfaction of someone who had learned to balance agricultural and industrial operations with equal skill. "The quarterly reports are final," he said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. "Our mineral partnerships are generating enough profit to expand operations into 3 additional counties." Eleanor smiled, feeling the baby move beneath her hand. "And the agricultural side? Record harvest, highest beef prices in 5 years, and more orders for garden produce than we can fill. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, it appears that everything you touch turns to gold." "Not gold," Eleanor replied, watching the lights begin to twinkle in the workers' quarters that had become a small town in their own right. "Something much more valuable. I turn things into what they were always meant to be." As the evening stars appeared over the valley that had become the center of a mining empire, Eleanor Harrison reflected on the journey that had brought her from despair to triumph. The woman who had been sold to pay debts had discovered that her true value lay not in meeting other people's expectations, but in exceeding her own. She had learned that strength wasn't about enduring suffering, but about transforming challenges into opportunities. Most importantly, she had proven that no one was truly barren. Not of children, not of capabilities, not of worth. Sometimes it just took the right soil, the right conditions, and the right recognition of potential for the most extraordinary growth to begin. The Harrison Mining and Agricultural Corporation would become one of the most successful enterprises in the Western territories, but Eleanor knew that its greatest achievement wasn't measured in dollars or acres. It was measured in the lives transformed, the opportunities created, and the proof that human potential could flourish in the most unexpected places when given the chance to grow. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse that Eleanor had established for the workers' families, a symbol of the community that had grown around the woman who had once been told she could never create life. As she listened to those young voices, Eleanor Harrison understood that she had indeed been fertile all along, not just in body, but in spirit, in mind, and in the limitless capacity to nurture greatness from the humblest beginnings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.